Should we get started?
Yeah, I'm excited.
Take the reins.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Welcome to Smooth Brain, the laid-back neuroscience podcast that is helping to fill the void coronavirus has made in our research communities, so we can have more spontaneous and laid-back, like bar talk conversation about our latest research. And today we're going to be talking about guilt, shame, and embarrassment. And we have some great guests today. Hongbo, do you want to introduce yourself first? Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hongbo Yu. I'm an assistant professor at UCSB. Since my graduate school, I've been fascinated about the neural and behavioral basis of social emotion, which include primarily guilt, shame, and embarrassment and gratitude. Right now, I'm leading a psychology and neuroscience lab where we are also kind of interested in the social emotion, but also moral judgment and moral decision making.
Awesome. Tom, you want to go next?
Yeah, my name is Tom Curitore. I am a writer, an artist, and producer in Los Angeles, California. I graduated from the California Institute of the Arts with a degree in performance art history and have slowly transitioned my practice into writing for the screen. I'm currently focusing on a project based on my life that involves a lot of guilt, shame, and embarrassment all on the page.
That's awesome. Zach and Aysenur?
Well, Aysenur here. I'm a developmental psychologist and I work in the Istanbul Bilgi University in Turkey as a postdoc researcher.
I'm Zach Benevento. I'm Tom's childhood friend. I was sort of a big brother / mentor figure to him when he was back in the day.
So many stories of embarrassment and shame.
Yeah, definitely. With that stuff. So
Yeah, no, we won't go there.
When did you first meet?
no, I'm kidding.
When did we met? I met Zach around the same time that I met you, Marianne. I think.
Okay.
It was
So
all around. Yeah, it was all the high school. Like, I mean, you guys all came from my friendship with our mutual friend Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I ended up in this circle.
Yeah.
Probably
like 15 years now. How long have we known each other? We've all known each other for too long.
Longer than 15 years, I think. Yeah, it's probably like close to 18.
Yeah, like 18 years.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Ooh, okay.
Our friendship can vote.
I mean, it really has like just managed to make its way over time. It's like
Yeah.
non-committal, completely non-committal, and just easy.
And I'm Marianne. I'm a postdoc researcher in the social, now I'm like, what's the name of our lab?
You're supposed to know the name by heart.
Social Neuroscience Lab, I think, SNL. All the labs are named like the same thing, but we study empathy mostly. So I'm looking at the neural mechanisms that track people's ability to decode someone else's emotions and how well they do that, especially under information constraints. But yeah, I'm super excited to have this conversation. It's such an interesting conversation to have because it's going to be like part science and then part also a creative introduction to guilt and shame, as well as, I guess, personal. So I thought we could start with just operationalizing or giving the definitions of embarrassment, guilt, and shame, and then move on to Hongbo's research. Well, I can read some definitions I got, and then maybe we can just get everyone's comments. Feel free to jump in. For embarrassment, the quote that I have here is, "What lies at the root of embarrassment is the anticipation of negative evaluation by others. In short, we become embarrassed when we perceive that the social image we want to project has been undermined and that others are forming negative impressions of us." So all three of these things have to deal with negative emotion in terms of social rejection or just not doing something good for the collective, and how we internalize them. Does anybody want to say anything about embarrassment?
I think the key word there is the anticipation, right?
Yeah.
Because there needs to be, you need to be in the presence of somebody else, either physically or mentally, in order to feel the embarrassment.
Yeah.
I mean, does that definition, I'm more gonna need to learn from everybody here, so my questions are gonna probably be like very rudimentary, but I'm just wondering, it said like embarrassment in a social context, but then also embarrassment for like a community, like at whole, like, is that, how does that jump so drastically, like from like an individual interaction to like going so quickly to think like for the entire good of like society?
Well, maybe embarrassment doesn't go as far as society, but I think well, if we're going to make like an evolutionary guess about these things, you don't want to get excluded from the group. If you're not a part of the group, you have lower survival chances,
Oh,
right?
as simple as that. Okay.
Yeah. So if you violate a social norm, I think you're likely to be embarrassed in the moment. It's like, I think of it as like an acute reaction, right? Like embarrassment shouldn't be something that lasts with you for the rest of your life. It kind of, you learn in the moment, maybe do something to correct it in the moment. But then guilt and shame are different. I think shame becomes a chronic form of embarrassment, right? When now like that embarrassment becomes embedded in your self-concept. The definition for guilt can be just shrunk down to I am bad. And then not guilt, sorry, for shame is I am bad. And then guilt is I did something bad. So guilt, yeah. Maybe Hongbo, do you want to give the definition of guilt or how you think of it?
Yeah, so actually before I actually talk about any definition or operationalization, I actually want to bring up like a concern or an issue that I always have in my past research, which is about like whether it is useful at all to have a kind of scientific or dictionary definition of these emotions.
Yeah.
So I think in our research, there's always two ways of understanding these kind of emotions. One is by like scientists or philosophers, they by conducting research or thought experiments, they arrive at a sort of more informative, more informed definition. And then when we measure those emotions in empirical studies, we instruct participants what we mean by guilt, shame, embarrassment, and they kind of conform to our definition. That's one approach. The other approach is we take whatever the folk intuition of these concepts and we take that as ground truths. And we don't have like an overarching scientific or philosophical definition, and we just trust what people thought about or how they feel about these experience in their everyday life and start from there. So I think both these two approaches are useful, and at some point there might be some overlap, I'm sure. But I just don't know how useful or necessary it is to start with a scientific or a dictionary definition and constrain ourselves like in these area.
Yeah. Would you say that you can't define it with words, but you would be able to define it with brain activity since you developed like a guilt signature? Like, do you think that there?
Well, I think the thing is, like when we talk about brain or any kind of measure, we have to have a definition or an operationalization of guilt versus not guilt behaviorally in our task to start with. So in that sense, we already have a definition.
Right.
It's not that I think that a more appropriate second approach will be to use text analysis or corpora analysis, apply those analyses to people's everyday conversation or fictions, or social media. Like when people actually talk about guilt and shame experience in their daily life, what do they mean, and how many topics they are like when they talk about guilt and shame and embarrassment. I think that will be an interesting future direction.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? So I I mean, in my research career, I've always, not always, but most of the time that I've done narrative analysis. And one of the methods that I use, which is significance analysis, it's like sentiment analysis. And then you go, like you said, you go through the text and see what kind of sentiment is there. Like, is it more effective? Are people using more effective words or cognitive words? And then you make judgments on, like, are they analytical, or do they have a negative, like, does this text has a negative tone or positive tone, etc. And then one of the difficulties that we experienced was deciding whether some words are purely effective, like meaning emotional or cognitive, because with every emotion, there's some sort of cognition as well, right? Like, for example, with the embarrassment, we said anticipation of someone. That means that there is some sort of cognitive process happening there, not just purely just feeling like a fear or like anger. You know, you just like go through your life experience, and then you have different references in life, like what is embarrassment, like what was the time that I felt embarrassed, and does that apply to this, and like stuff like that. Like there's memory, for example, and there's attention involved. All these emotions, the height of it will change probably based on what you think of.
And I think even for fear and anger, like this more basic emotion, there are also this kind of cognition, right? If you have a different like list of things that you feel afraid about, then you'll probably have different fear response. So that's also like kind of depends on how you interpret the thing that you are experiencing.
Right. So maybe we can go, I mean, to make it more fun, maybe we can do a little experiment here and think about the last time that we felt embarrassed. And then go from that and see if that would confirm this like definition that Marianne read early on.
Okay. Who's going first?
I can start. I mean, when I prepare for this podcast, I think about my guilt, shame, embarrassing feelings. So I think, first of all, embarrassment and shame are, as Marianne mentioned, it's really hard to dissociate. So I guess conceptually and semantically, there probably is some overlap. So, for example, for me, since I moved to the US, the most frequent shame, embarrassing experience or moment will be one during a conversation I stuck and I can't find a word to express myself. And I think at the same time, or at that moment, I feel really embarrassed when all the audience are waiting for me. And when I kind of recall such experience later, I feel kind of shameful, because that kind of define yourself, right? A language kind of define yourself. And if you can't get it right, you feel that you don't have, like, part of yourself is kind of not exist.
I can relate to that as a non-native English speaker. I think so.
So I think that's more.
You feel embarrassed at the moment, and then you just like, oh, I should have known that. That's like the shame. Like, oh, I know that word. That's like,
yeah.
I was bad.
Yes. So negate your own kind of importance, significance, or even existence.
I could think of one that's like not super serious, so easier to share, but I got pretty embarrassed recently because it's like on social media. I think I sent this to Zach. Somebody had stolen a joke that I made, like word for word, in a much bigger account than mine. And I was so mad. And so I like DM'd the person that shared it, who's like another big account that I didn't know. And I was like, I wrote this joke. And then like they were like, yo, chill. Like this is like
What was the joke?
What was the joke?
I
So are you feeling shame or embarrassment right now?
yes. Yeah, but then the guy was like, oh, this joke is like so old, like you didn't come up with it. And then I was so embarrassed that I got mad is kind of what happened. I was just like, I was so embarrassed that I cared at all, like enough. Yeah, and then I ended up becoming friends with the guy that I messaged. Like now we're friends. So it's like, I guess it has a good ending. But I did like deactivate my social media for a while because I was just like, and I would say that would be the shame component because I was like, I hate that this stupid platform where I know nobody and has like no real world impact made me like so like feel such an emotion and to react so quickly. I just thought it's so embarrassing and shameful. I don't know.
I mean, I feel that I think that type of embarrassment every single day right now, and that shame, I think navigating in this current world and also trying to be a part of like a new system or like operating around like people who are more established than I am or more sort of knowing in the field than I am, and finding myself making minor sort of like even grammatical errors or mispronouncing a word or misinterpreting like an opportunity or something like on a daily basis. And I think something I was kind of catching from everything y'all were saying was there's such nuance in this. And from a scientific standpoint, how do you all interpret nuance in both your narrative sort of research or your scientific research when there's such concrete examples? I mean, how do you define based on what someone's writing, if they're writing truth or if they're writing in a persona or if they're writing from a fractured memory? I mean, how do you interpret that sort of aspect of shame or embarrassment or guilt when people perform what we want to see every day, of them? How do you find the truth or the nuance in that? I think I don't know if that's like a question that can be answered or if there's parts of that are explored within like the scientific field.
That's a valid question. I would be interested in hearing that because it's really difficult. I mean,
I don't think it is a valid question. And I think Tom should be embarrassed for asking it.
I think it is.
I mean, I saw you, Zach. I saw you waiting.
If we can identify that they're different, he's asking, how do you measure that at all?
I mean, how do you measure nuance in like the spectrum of like this topic? Like, is there even nuance in science? Like, do you allow for nuance in science? Because I've never seen it.
Okay, that's
especially.
I can be part of that. Okay, so I think nuance in science maybe would be called individual differences for us.
Okay.
And on the whole, what our field does is actually consider individual difference noise. Like we usually want to minimize it and we want to get it like the group average, which can be good because it helps you generalize to more and more people, but can also be bad because then it also, like you're saying, forsakes like actual individual differences and nuances in people. My guess would be that like everybody's brain, is going to have a slightly different representation, even if they experience the same exact stimulus, like even like, an apple, a square, etc., because of our prior associations with things related to that in our life and then our expectations of what it is. And so, a really complex emotion like guilt or shame is going to be individualized, but that potentially there's some invariant core to that experience that's conserved across people and maybe even conserved across different types of animals as well. I don't know about shame, but like for some things, like for threat, like that's conserved across like I think almost everything with a single neuron, right? Or something, I don't know. Maybe Hongbo, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think you said it really well, and I just want to add one point, which is, so when we talk about individual differences in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, I mean, at least right now, we're talking about individual differences in quantity, right? So we ran regression, we ran correlation, but the underlying definition or the concept is the same. So we assume everyone had used this definition or used this representation, just that everyone have a different degree. But I think it's also interesting, maybe looking forward, is to look at individual differences in terms of quality. So for example, guilt and shame. In my study, for example, so I operationalize guilt experience as being responsible for someone else's harm. So you cause harm to someone else. But different people have a different degree of reaction. But it's also possible that different participants have different individuals. They have different definition, or they have different phenomenology of guilt. So they may feel, so one participant may feel X. So when they experience X, they feel guilty, but another participant may feel, when they experience Y, they feel guilty. So I hope in the future that we could also encompass these kind of qualitative individual differences. And one way that we could achieve that is to first really, as I mentioned, look into the social media and corpus, how people actually use guilt and how they actually experience in what situation they experience guilt and shame in their everyday life. And that may give us like a more a broad spectrum of the phenomena.
Okay, so that makes me think of a couple of things. I'll combine these. One of your early studies where you have people look into the eyes, or like a video of that person's eyes after they had harmed them, and that people are really uncomfortable doing that. So that idea, plus like searching social media, I feel like has taken upon itself to inflict a lot of guilt and shame and try to create norms or enforce norms in this sort of anonymous, environment that people aren't really familiar with yet, right? It's a kind of thing where you can't see people's eyes,
right?
Right. What do you think about with that? What do you think is the meaning of avoiding eye contact? Why are people uncomfortable when they make eye contact? And then how does that translate into this new social arena of which you don't have to make eye contact ever?
Well, so the eye contact is just one kind of manifestation of guilt. I don't think that we could immediately link that physiological reaction to people's narrative of their guilt experience in social media. Yeah, so I don't know. So for the corpus analysis, we don't really need to start with the eye contact. That's specific to this kind of face-to-face interaction, and you don't have to define guilt solely in this context. We feel guilt in multiple other ways.
Yeah.
I like to see all the things people don't post. Like we could record their phones, like the things that they write and then delete, or the photo that they don't post, or the story that they put on then delete 2 seconds later for some reason. That feels more of like a guilt response, or like a shameful response to me in that realm than like just what
that
you
would
see.
be ideal. That would be, but that would be thought police. Thought policeman.
Yeah,
I mean, there needs to be, Instagram must be storing those drafts.
Oh, absolutely. And Twitter, I'm sure they study it. There's somebody made a bot that there's like one big account. This guy actually blocked me because I liked too many of his posts, so I can't even see what he does anymore. But
How did you have a shame response to that?
I did. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that people would notice me.
Wait, somebody blocked you for liking all their stuff?
What is it with you and these social media accounts? Like you and these people are just not, what are you doing?
Are you just liking his comments on the unrelated?
It's the first time I ever saw this account, and it was just, I was blown away by it. Everything he was posting was just like, if you were my girlfriend, I'd buy you. And like, there's like all these shoes, and it's just like all this stuff was like just trying to get women to like it or whatever. And so I was just
you were You were like, I don't feel any shame in wanting to be a sugar baby right now. You were like, I have no shame in wanting these shoes. I have no shame in this man.
Yeah.
And he
Well,
was
no,
like,
shame that
I
he
am guilty that I don't like you, so I'm gonna block you. And that's how it happened. That was the shame and the guilt all responding.
But somebody made a bot that scrapes his post, and every time he deletes a post, it posts it to the bot, so you can see all of his deleted posts.
Wow, that sounds like revenge.
That I think is particularly mean. I think there's a lot of mean stuff that happens on social media, and everyone acts like it's not a big deal. They're like, close your eyes or whatever, but I don't know.
I mean, that's why I don't post. I think one time I got called a fag on a picture that I posted, and I was done. I was like, it took one comment on a picture of somebody just like ripping me for nothing for me to like not feel that it was a space in which to like put myself on. Meanwhile, I'm the first person to make fun of somebody like in the real world or in this game. Zach knows this very well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I'm the first person to call out anybody for anything, but I felt that in that space of like not knowing this individual and experiencing some sort of I mean, for lack of a better word, attack, like a quick like quip at me was enough for the unknown of it to cause that fear response and that sort of shame response. And, like you were saying, that threat, I think so quickly, because there isn't somebody face to face with you, you don't see what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And I think that's also scary in that space, is not knowing who they are behind that versus what they say. I mean, words are words, but like the emotion behind them, I think is something that I've always been interested in kind of exploring. Like, I could say anything in any way, but it's how I present it to you is which it's going to cause your sort of emotional response, right? Like in stupid terms. So
No.
Yeah. I think also, if it's out of context, I think it's way easier for you to like project all of like your history of insecurities onto that one thing, because now you just don't even know what it is, and it's just going to trigger up like potentially like our deepest unresolved stuff.
I mean, I think it's mutual. I think when you go and block someone or restrict someone's account or block them on your phone, or you end a friendship with someone by ghosting them or whatever you do, and when they do that to you, there is sort of like, it's the way to shame and guilt and kind of like, without having to actually speak to it or confront it, it's an easy way to kind of like to put people in a corner. I guess we have new techniques now at alienating and disassociating each other from like, a human context. We just see each other as like these images. We don't see each other as like full flesh breathing kind of experienced people who have thoughts and all of that.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's like an interesting space, I guess. Social media kind of plays a whole new other thing when you talk about shame and guilt. I think when you talk about it in like an actual like person to person context.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be really interesting because as Marianne mentioned that like our evolutionary past that shape our kind of emotional reactions and behavioral reactions to that kind of situation. But this new technology like social media has fundamentally changed the way that we connected to other human beings. And it will be really interesting to see how that technology induced kind of change in our social connection, also change the way that we feel guilt and shame, how we react to that kind of events.
I mean, are those evolutionary tracks of shame and guilt similar to like intergenerational traumas, or are those different, like psychologically versus like neurologically? Like, would you consider those two paths like parallel to each other, like in the same vein, or is it different to have like an evolutionary kind of shame, guilt, or trauma for like a group versus a intergenerational shame, guilt, or trauma that's passed on? Is that
Yeah, so I don't think there's a lot known with intergenerational trauma yet. From what I understand of it, most of it's been studied in the threat context where, yeah, so if so the mother is pregnant and experienced a significant, like a PTSD inducing event or some really big stressor, the like amount of cortisol dysregulation in the mother actually affects the activation of the genes in the developing baby. And in that way, it could actually like make the baby more likely to develop PTSD or depression later on. So that's like one idea of like a genetic way of transferring the intensity of an event. But I think when people talk about intergenerational trauma too, it's also like narrative storytelling, and also like the way you're being raised too. Like if your parents are feeling shame, you'll probably just learn by their interactions with the environment what you should be like shying away from, or like we take a lot of cues that I don't think we can even verbalize till later. So I think it hits you from two levels, but I don't know. My guess I think shame and trauma have a lot to do with each other. I'm not totally clear how they interact. I think that shame is a block to recovery and not really. I can't think of a situation where shame makes anybody a better person. Other than
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
So like,
yeah, that's true. I think there are ways.
Okay, hit me.
Yeah, let's think about like in the semantic way, right? So if you said that shame is something that's bad, then would you consider shameless something good?
Oh no,
I would say an assault victim, a victim of sexual assault or any sort of violent assault, the shame translates into power at a certain point when the story is able to be told. I would say like the shame of experiencing like some sort of like trauma, like or threat like that, like physically an assault on you, like there's a shameful element to that of that experience. And I think eventually you're able to translate that shame into power
or anger.
Or anger. And then and that anger then I think folds over into other things, and eventually, I mean, you either go two paths at that point, but I think that I think that could be a context in which shame was used to empower somebody.
Like you had to get through it though. The shame,
the
power from the shame comes from no longer being
ashamed. Yeah, I think.
I mean, also, like you guys were talking about people doing stuff on the internet anonymously. If a lot of those people were exposed, they would feel shame. Like they don't feel shame because they're doing it anonymous.
Right.
I mean, you could think in Hollywood too, like all the DMs and all the slide into the DMs, like the Army Hammer thing, the cannibalism thing. If that never got public, how shameful that is for him.
Very shameful. He should definitely be
cannibal.
Army Hammer, the actor, and heir to the Hammer fortune,
like the Arm & Hammer
cannibal. Yeah, Arm & Hammer.
No, not Arm & Hammer.
Army Hammer, the actor.
What is he in?
The one who plays gay.
Different corporation they were.
Yeah. No, we're not talking about not Arm & Hammer, Army Hammer. We're going off topic. Marianne doesn't even know who Jennifer Lopez is. Are you the one who I showed pictures of celebrities to, and then you don't know who they are? Who was that?
That's Nick Cruz.
Oh yes, that's not you. That's Nick. Okay.
He doesn't know who Beyonce is. I'm not that.
I mean, that's crazy. But anyway, we're off topic. No, I think. But sorry, Zach, I cut you off.
No, I'm just saying shame is, those people. Shame in a different context would prevent those people from saying those things, or at least hold them back. Not that obviously people do things like that in real life too, but
yeah. So what I don't understand about that is like I give myself shame more than any other person gives me shame.
By sending things?
No, like in my own brain, like where I'm just like, I can't believe I did that. I probably like explode a situation in my head more than like anybody else who was present would think that it was bad or harmful or shameful.
But see, that shame from that sounds like I think
Isn't
shame,
that embarrassment?
yeah, I was gonna say, isn't there now like very smaller sort of subcategories that we go into when we start thinking about like the specifics of that? Like I feel in my head like I'm so shameful when I sent that, or who am I for doing that? But obviously it's part of you. So is that repression? Like you're repressing now a part of yourself, and that like ties into all of this? Like everything kind of starts
I
snowballing?
think like shame is like more like you steal something, like you shoplift something and then you just like feel
That was
shame.
bad. That's a
That's
shameful
guilt. I think
situation.
that's guilt because you just
Yeah,
violated.
I always thought maybe I thought incorrectly, but I always thought one was more internal and the other was more in your relation to other people around you.
That
Yeah,
would
like
be
shame is internal, right? It's something where guilt is something that happens with people.
You need to be called guilty, I guess, to feel guilty.
yeah.
I wish we had somebody who could.
If I go back to some of the definitions, I like this one.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
Let's crack the Oxford Dictionary open again.
But this actually came from one of the articles Hongbo sent out like a few weeks ago when they were talking about misogyny. But it says that misogyny is a manifestation of shame, most obviously when perpetrated by individual men, but perhaps even going beyond that. And that could theoretically make a basis for empathy and solidarity between the perpetrators and the victims.
Yes, I remember that. I thought about that specific thing. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Because I feel that, I think that's why I like movies like Taxi Driver and stuff. I definitely feel sympathy for these characters that are built up that their characters are built around like hating women, right? Or being misogynistic in a way. And I don't feel threatened by them. I tend to feel empathetic towards them. And I think I try to like think about why is that my reaction? But there is something about like when someone feels shame and embarrassment, and I think there's some studies like this too, when people show that shame, then like the group welcomes them back. Like they want them to deflect, right? It's like you're showing submission.
I mean, we see that in the LGBTQ community almost every day. And then like, I mean, my experiences as like a gay man with straight men, or with men who are on the like DL as like a normal thing, like men who are like, in the day-to-day, like obviously are married or with women, but on their low-key on their like internet accounts will go and hit up guys and try to and do those sort of things on the DL, like that sort of like homophobia as well as misogyny, and like where that sort of stems from the repression of that, like the shamefulness of like hating women for some reason is like more feels like a shame of like not being able to like understand or honor them, just like
yeah. Yeah,
like
the hatred's a misconstrual of like something wrong with themselves, right?
Yeah, like I think about that with like men who like straight men who like to get not to be like so explicit, but like it's such a thing. Like it's such a thing. Like I mean, yeah. As long as there's no ass play, it's fine. But like I'm just saying, like the context in which like these things come up as shame. Like, why is treating a woman with respect shameful? Why is experiencing pleasure from other men shameful? Why, do we find these sort of relationships, or why do we find our fetishes or our kinks shameful? Taboo, like words we don't use anymore. Like we don't use the word taboo anymore. I don't think I hear that in any sort of contemporary context, but I hear shame and guilt and embarrassed and all of those things so much more prevalently, like culture and at large. And when we talk about these issues with mass shootings, or we talk about these issues with cases of assault or bullying or cancel culture, like everything kind of comes back to this idea that there was some sort of shame associated with how their experiences were. And like I don't know, that's a rant, I guess, but it kind of goes off this idea of in the context of misogyny, like
Tommy, so that reminds me of a theoretical definition of shame that I read a while ago in a philosophy books, so they hypothesize that shame is caused by your like deviant from your ideal self. So you have a representation of your what is ideal, and this ideal may not be socially acceptable, but that is something that you still treat as ideal. And then your behavior or your personality or your characteristics and like your history somehow deviate from that ideal, and you don't see a way to correct that. So that makes you feel kind of shameful. That's the one that philosophical definition that I read.
Is that like subconscious? Is that like a subconscious sort of imprint that is left on you?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily not necessarily implicit. It also can be conscious.
Okay.
I can definitely see that, because I'm imagining if somebody like ideal version of themselves is like, I'm funny and I come up with original jokes, and then they like post what they think is an original joke.
Zach's feeling about himself.
Come up with that's not original. You would feel like deep shame. There's like a big deviation there between.
Yeah, if someone was like, "Hey Zach, you're not funny," then that would be shameful.
Yeah, exactly.
I would feel terrible.
There's a study from the 90s where they have participants have to come in and sing a song, but they think they're alone, but they're being recorded, and then afterwards they force them to like watch the recording of themselves like singing karaoke, and people are like mortified. But then there's like a second half of the study where they allow some people to talk about their experience of embarrassment and some people not. And then they rate their level of embarrassment after that. And the people who were able to talk about their experience, like significantly reduce in embarrassment, whereas the people who didn't get that opportunity, like persevered. And yeah, that makes me think like, how do you transition from embarrassment to shame? And why is it so important? Like, I think with a lot of emotions, you get a real effect by talking about it with other people. Why? Why is that?
Is that like finding relativity? Is that just like
yourself
like if I said like, oh, I pissed myself, I was laughing so hard, and someone was like, oh, I've done that.
Yeah.
All of a sudden it's neutral. Like it's neutral.
Like in the conversation, the people are probably like, yeah, it's fine. It's not a big deal. Like, I don't know. I haven't seen them, but I'm sure the person was like, no, that was really embarrassing. Did you watch it? Like you look like a jackass. Like if it went that way, maybe they would still feel embarrassed or shameful. But I'm sure the person was trying to make them feel better when they were having their conversation about it.
Though I want to be the devil's advocate here, because the kinds of examples that we're giving here are pretty innocent. It's just like no harmful. Like you just say, oh, I've shared something on social media, felt shameful. Like how about, I mean, the other extreme would be like a Nazi, right? Just like saying,
I was gonna say Hitler.
Maybe whatever.
Maybe to bring it into the middle between those two.
But he didn't. People experience, I think, such harsh forms of like rejection and like communal like pushing. Like they get so pushed far from their community that they feel they're a part of. We see this in the gay community, within like the Black community. We see this in different sorts of like activist groups within certain or like on like leftist or right like conservative sides. Like we see the fight amongst each other. I think, you know, like the canceling of like the cancel culture within each other's contexts, like where we go and we take people within our community and we break them down.
You think the next Hitler is gonna come from being canceled on Twitter?
I mean, how many mass shootings have happened because people have been canceled on social media? I mean, like we're finding that like there are so many.
Like, it is very simplistic to think
just
that
based on the context.
Shot people because they were canceled on social media.
Yeah, there's obviously
things are not that simple.
I mean, these are unhealthy.
They're not that simple, but they're also trigger points. And I think everybody has a trigger.
Right. So I think most people are, well, either internalize it. If you have internalized shame, I don't think you could be motivated to commit genocide, right? Wouldn't you want to withdraw from society instead of going out further into it? And
I mean, I'm thinking right now about that crazed video during the different, I can't remember where it was because I'm not smart enough, but in where that white man was walking through a crowd of Black Lives Matter protesters while the military was coming towards the Black Lives Matter protesters, and he was walking with a fucking rifle, and they let him go right past him, and he killed
Kyle Rittenhouse,
I believe that was it. Yeah, I just think about those people who do go onto the field, and I think about the way that we're sort of radicalized, like as a society. I mean, like the fact that like people get behind things, they believe that there's a singular truth to things, and this is every type of group, and they apply that, and then they guilt and shame each other into believing that the other one is wrong. And then we have to push our beliefs to be so radicalized at a certain point to feel that we're making a point, like into something that like actually stands for what is good versus what is bad. Like, and I don't know, I think that also stems from guilt and shame personally.
Yeah. Well, so maybe Hongbo, maybe you have insight on this, because all right, I would buy that like Hitler felt extreme rejection and probably shame. But then if he goes on to like, hurt people, like the studies that you have looked at are like people are very uncomfortable hurting other people, right?
Right.
Yeah. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so I think I definitely see a point in the example of Hitler, although I'm not sure that's like that the entire story must be extremely complicated.
Yeah,
but
of course.
think
I don't want to also say that I'm simplifying anything.
Yeah.
Aysenur, but yeah.
So I think there's a psychological tension or motivation to compensate, right? So if you you feel that what you actually are and what your ideal self is kind of don't match, there's a gap. So I think there's a way that people really want to compensate, and then there's a good way to compensate, and there's a bad way to compensate. And then when I said that shame is not always bad, is that there could be a good way to like self-improvement, right? So you can improve yourself and shorten the gap between the ideal self and your actual self. So that's I think that's a healthy way. But another like unhealthy way will be to maybe cancel all the eyes that look at you, or those who are aware of the gap between your ideal self and your actual self. That's an unhealthy way of react to this kind of deviation.
So you're saying like when people, I guess, they see you out not as that, you pushing them away and getting them
right,
getting rid of them, so
yeah,
disrupt that.
You either kind of improve yourself to shorten the gap, or you kind of destroy the eyes, the observers.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. That's saying my stupidity in a smart way. I like that.
I think it's so much harder to work on yourself than to avoid, or even to go in this other direction of actually then, like annihilating. Actually, yeah, and that article you said too about the family annihilators, that blew my mind. That article said that like a person like kills their family like once every week across the globe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To me, that's like a really extreme, unhealthy way to react to this kind of gap.
Yeah, definitely unhealthy.
That's like I mean, I guess there's probably also less literal versions of that where people essentially just alienate themselves from their family.
Yeah.
That's kind of social withdrawal, or
Yeah, that's why I tend to think of shame as bad, because if it causes you to withdraw, you don't feel safe enough to take the risk to improve yourself. I don't know. Sometimes we've talked about like 12-step programs on this in the past, but I think the 12-step programs are powerful in that way because you go into a room where people have done maybe similar shameful things as you, right? And you can share openly, maybe not right away, but eventually like you become more comfortable sharing. And then the whole thing is about improvement and resolving that gap as well, like who you want to be and finding ways to actually make amends, like literally do things to correct whatever you still feel guilt about or shame about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It makes me think those things tend to be very healthy. Yeah.
And another thought is that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like shame can also operate in two modes. So one is like an experience, the one you actually did something and you feel shame, and also an anticipated mode where you, before you do that, you think, oh, if I do that, I'll feel that's the shameful thing, so I don't do that. So I think that's also another way that shame sort of shape our behavior and kind of constrain our behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Aysenur, do you want to say something?
I lost my thought.
Sorry about that.
Well, oh, sorry.
I think I was just thinking about if like the times that I cheated on exams.
I think the times you cheated on Zach is what I said. I was like, whoa.
That's why I lit this. I was ready to sit back and I was like, oh, the times she's cheated on Zach. Let's go.
Let's listen. No, I was thinking about the times that I cheated on exams and like, did I feel shame? No, not necessarily, when I think back. But did I feel guilty? Yes, I felt guilty because guilt, I think it's like at the end of the day, I feel like I broke justice, like the people had the same chances as me who have taken that exam, and I just violated the rule. And then
how did you cheat? Did you over somebody's shoulder? What did you do?
No, I was just like there was this one exam in college, and I just like it was so stupid. It was such a stupid class, and I just like I opened the book on my lap and just
Well, if it was that easy, I mean, that just seems like nobody cares.
But at the same time, you feel like you cannot just help and feel guilty because some other people had the chance and they didn't do it. Maybe they failed. I don't know. I didn't keep statistics on who failed and who not. But like I don't feel shame because that's just like, oh, I passed it. I don't care. I don't personally don't care. It's just I don't even remember the class right now. But
I don't think I ever cheated.
That's an interesting point.
Stuff into a graphing calculator, but I feel like if you're allowed to have a graphing calculator, you're allowed to have whatever on the graphing calculator. That was my.
Yeah, that's different because like other students should have figured it out themselves. You don't feel guilty about that.
But I think
here are calculators before exams.
Well, I think you made an interesting point. Like you said, you didn't care about the class. It was a stupid class. It was a test. You don't even remember it. So it's like, how would you that you already set yourself up like you kind of protected yourself going into that situation. You were like, who cares? It's over. Like, I don't want to do this. So is that guilt and shame? Or is that just like not giving a fuck? Like at the end, like, is that even like are you applying guilt and shame to that because societally you feel like that situation?
Can I maybe explore why you feel guilty a little bit? Is because then you're now on the other side of it where you're instructing college classes and probably failing taking and failing them. So part of you probably thinks, oh, I'm failing this kid. But when I was a student, maybe I did a little.
Bingo.
So it's not even about
context. It's all about the context.
Yeah.
Who you are now when you're looking back and feeling guilty.
It comes up like every time you go to grade a test, it comes up in subconsciously or consciously when you're taking the effort, maybe more so to understand each student's perspective because you have like an overemphasize empathy.
Yeah,
You have so much empathy.
There was a
because
time
I don't
when
want them to feel ashamed, but I
Yeah.
want them to feel guilty. Definitely.
there was a time when something came up for Aysenur and I had to proctor a test for her. And I promise I did not look at all. I was like on my phone the whole time. And if those kids cheated, every single kid in that class could have cheated. I would not.
Well, my dad was dying at the time,
Well,
so nobody cared.
I mean, that's another context for like not. I think when you're in vulnerable, high stress situations that you have fight or flight sort of like mentality in, or there's something happening around you that you feel like you need to make a quick response to, you lose all sorts of feelings of guilt, shame, embarrassment, empathy, anything, and you just sort of fight. And I wonder, like, that sort of seems like a very, that seems like an example of something like that, where it's like there's something greater happening that like the minor, like the magnitude of like me not being there and someone else cheating is not as important as, like, for example, my father dying. Like I can put that all aside and allow everybody to kind of act on their own accord, let my moral compass go in order to like take care of something that's obviously more prevalently important to like me. So like, do we do that? I guess, is there science to that too? Like where we resort to like our extreme points and throw those sort of other aspects and empathies away because we have to act in a self-preservational way or for someone else's safety?
So there's some interesting work on acting in a crisis for somebody else, in which the bystander effect, are you familiar with this? Where classically in psychology, they say that, like, if there's a bunch of people standing around someone who is ill or sick and needs immediate attention, people are less likely to help than if it's just one person around. And I think people used to explain this as like a diffusion of responsibility. But the better explanation is embarrassment. People report not helping because they weren't sure if it was actually a crisis, and they felt embarrassed if they treated it like one, that they would either embarrass that person or embarrass themselves by overreacting. Yeah, which is wild. And the other thing too is actually a significant number of people in this country die because they're too embarrassed to get colonoscopies or pap smears. Like, like literally embarrassed about their own bodies, so they don't even get checked up when they're sick.
I mean, I know so many people honestly, in the past year and a half, there's 3 people right now who I know have prostate cancer, and but I mean, just in they're younger and not going in, when they needed to go for things. And everybody talks about those things as embarrassing. Yeah. I mean, especially as men in particular, like in having to get younger and younger and getting yourself cared for, going to the doctor, going to the dentist, knowing you have problems, like knowing you have to get something fixed and what the greater significance of that could actually cause you. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of a perfect segue into where I started writing my story that I shared with you guys, where I think I started writing from a perspective of the unknown and what you do when you don't take care of those things that are important, and when you are shameful of your truth and your life and your experience and what that could cause you down the line.
Do you want to talk about your
I mean, not really, but I just think that's an interesting.
I want to hear more about guilt.
And guilt, yeah.
From Hongbo?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh.
Wait, Tom was talking.
I know.
No, I want to hear about. I want to hear more about guilt. I was just saying that's an interesting.
You just embarrassed him. You just embarrassed him.
I think Zach just sort of embarrassed the room by silencing like across the board. It was like a after Zach spoke.
I need to call Marianne out on her scheduling. Oh, let's talk about the research.
Yeah, let's talk more about the research.
All right, I think
I'm really interested in the bystander effect, because that sort of plays into more of what I'm kind of had experienced as a person who experienced trauma in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I will say that like our folk intuition and everyday experience is more interesting than the empirical research that we have so far. I mean, I'm not saying empirical research is not important, just that personally, I don't think the current like empirical study of guilt and shame has kind of even close to the complexity and richness of guilt and shame experience that we have in our everyday lives. So I would like to talk more about like our experience and our way of conceptualize these emotion and experience.
What did you study? Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, I was gonna say, as someone who researches this, like, you know, every day, I guess, or in your life's work, and the research that you've done surrounding, like, even like looking into people's eyes and stuff, where do you see the research going in that direction that you just, it's not so much about like the reading and the writing, but in the experience, like, how will you find that your research will evolve, I guess, in now 2021, in this new world we're living in, with these sort of new ideas and stories that people are sharing, more so now, I think, than ever, stories of guilt and shame and trauma and personal experience. Like, how do you take all of that and sort of synthesize it into what we may be able to understand about each other in the future?
That's a great point. So I think in my research, and I guess in social neuroscience study of social emotion, we have to, at least at current stage, we have to focus on really very specific aspect of guilt and shame experience. So for example, in my study, I operationalize responsibility in causing others harm. So that's really like just one example, right? But to do a laboratory-based experiment, we have to be more specific, and we have to control other factors so that we can get a more interpretable results. So that's like the reality right now. So so one line of my research will be to kind of like continue this line of research. So for example, in the study that in the eye contact study, we don't know the underlying neural mechanism. So a future study will be to, while they kind of interact with the other person face to face, we can record their brain activity and see what neural process give rise to these gaze avoidance phenomena. So that like become more and more specific in that very specific area or aspect of guilt and shame experience. But I think more broadly, I would be interested to really understand the complexity and richness of people's guilt and shame experience in everyday life by, for example, studying their expression of guilt and shame in social media or in novels or fictions, so that we can have a better understanding of not how psychology defines guilt and shame, but how people actually experience guilt and shame. And that may, in turn, inform future experiments, right? If we know people feel guilt and shame for A, B, and C, then we could probably manipulate those factors in our study rather than just manipulate one.
Mm-hmm.
What made you interested in studying guilt?
That's actually quite random. That's like back to the second year of my graduate school, and I have no idea what I'm going to do. So a student a few years senior than me who will be graduate that year told me, okay, Hongbo, I have a task design that I already have the program, but I don't have time to materialize it. Would you like to take care of it? I said, okay, yeah, I don't have a project, so I just take that from him. And so I started my first guilt neuroscience study. And then that's the one where I think I shared it yesterday, where we measure their brain activity when they cause pain to another person. So that's how I started. And then as I analyze the data and read literature, I find more questions than this study can resolve. So, I mean, I become more and more curious about this topic. And then I designed the eye tracking study, where I actually want to see in a face-to-face interaction rather than just like in an isolated context, how people react, how people's body and their face react to these kind of guilt context. So that's how I started.
How do you see your work impacting people? Like, do you think you could give people feedback on like brain activity that's related to guilt or shame and help them work on their own? Or like, yeah, how do you see it? If you could apply it ideally in the real world, how would you do it?
So I think I don't think like a direct application, but I think one thing that I'm planning right now is to kind of apply these type of guilt induction social interaction tasks to, for example, individual with autism spectrum disorder, and see how like which cognitive component that they don't have that kind of give rise to their lack of guilt feeling, and how that would in turn impact their caregivers.
Yeah, and they avoid eye contact. You would expect that to be a different neurorepresentation that underlies the eye contact avoidance then, right?
But that's an interesting point, right? So traditionally we thought that, people with ASD feel averse of looking at other people's eye, but recent study actually show that this may not be the case. So they're not aversive to them, but they just are not interested. Okay. So for a neurotypical participant, we have a kind of a natural tendency to look at other people's eye when we talk to them, but individual without ASD, they don't have that kind of tendency. So, but let's say if you present the video to the individual with ASD, so that the other person's eye is right at their fixation, they don't avoid it. Okay. They just don't have an interest to kind of actively focus on the other person's eye. So with that knowledge, one thing we can do is to present, like, for example, the video of another people to ASD and control, so that the other person's eye is at their fixation, and see how like the responsibility, like your responsibility in causing harm to that person, differentially influence your eye fixation process.
That is so interesting.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we're getting close to the hour. We can go around and maybe say whatever is left on our minds, or does anyone have a good idea for a way to close? Yeah.
Let's end with a deep dive into Tom's work with guilt and shame.
I started working on guilt and shame. I mean, I've been guilty my whole life, but I've been started working with guilt and shame more recently during the pandemic, because I found that there were things that I was not dealing with and that I had experienced and going through. And one of those was my sort of not understanding what had happened to me when my father got sick in 2017, and discovering his diagnosis of HIV through years of basically like repressing his sexuality as a gay man and his experiences, and sort of finding that I was on a similar sort of self-destructive path. And finding the like sort of intergenerational traumas that were kind of existing in my life, and also confronting for the first time through therapy and being medicated, a repressed experience of sexual assault that happened in 2006 in New York. And so I was assaulted by a taxi cab driver after one of our nights when we were out in the city, and I was wasted, and I took a cab home to New York, to Staten Island, and the driver pulled over and just completely, it was just a fucking fucked up situation. And it was something I had never spoken about until about like 2 years ago when I started therapy. and realized all of this like guilt and shame and repressed stuff that I hadn't really thought about all kind of accumulated when I was in the hospital with my father in Miami. So I started processing all of this and started writing. And I found that writing the truth, I was starting to find that it was easier to put it on a page than it was to talk about. And so that sort of started a whole thing where I was writing, and I started putting together groups of people who are now working with me on this project who found relativity in that story and finding experiences with, you know, family and intergenerational trauma and shame and guilt and assault and my parents' experiences with these things. And, you know, all of that kind of came into the story that's now going to be a TV show eventually. So it was sort of, that's where I, you know, when I saw your podcast, you know, we had started chatting, and I was like, you know, what would be so interesting would be to kind of bring in this sort of narrative sense of like, you know, how does shame and guilt sort of get expressed, you know, and that's sort of where I was sort of interested in discussing, you know, Marianne, with you, that sort of perspective on it. And like, you know, I mean, I had so much guilt and so much shame that when I had gotten back from New York at that point in the end of 2017, I had a full body rash from my neck all the way down. And there was I went to doctors and panels and blood work, and it wouldn't go away. And eventually I had a therapist tell me that it was basically for, you know, in terms of like, you know, talking holistically, you're physically manifesting like your repressed state, like your guilt and all of the shame that you're holding in, and all these things that you're not talking about are basically becoming scabs on your body. And it was crazy, because as soon as I started therapy and as soon as I started opening up about my experiences, you know, as a gay man and things that I hadn't talked about, and like all of those like aspects of it that I was kind of going through in like those years of high school, like leading into like those years of my life, like with the drinking and the drugs and everything, things that I wasn't talking about that were happening outside of that. And when I started talking about those, the rash started to go away.
Oh.
And it was weird to kind of find that sort of like, I mean, I was on no medication or anything. It was literally just kind of opening up, and like that really sort of allowed that to stop, to kind of just disappear. And so, yeah, it's a really, that's sort of where my point came in. And I started kind of finding people who had those experiences too.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think like one of the most powerful things about having shame is like when you do share it, it makes more people feel comfortable with their own, and it like it creates a stronger bond, I think, between people, and trust, which is like such a powerful thing, I think.
I mean, really, it comes down to storytelling. I mean, really, all we're doing, I mean, is just storytelling and like sharing stories, and those stories we interpret and find our own sort of like truths in, I think too, you know?
Yeah. The immune responses are interesting, because like your immune system is really intrinsically tied to your stress. And there's theories now that depression is like a chronic sickness behavior, where like if you look at like the physiological manifestations of depression, it's people withdraw when you're injured. You're supposed to withdraw from things because you're more vulnerable. You save energy by being, you know, more stationary, sometimes avoid eating. And so some of like the ideas now, and they look at changes in immune function and autoimmune reactions in depression, and they think that it's like you are actually like having a sickness response. And it makes kind of sense along with that you would like have hives or something, because that's more like your like histamines coming out, right?
Yeah, I think also too, you know, I had spent a total of almost 3 solid weeks prior to in an ICU, hospital waiting room.
Because,
Like
Of the attack, or like
No, because my dad was, when I was in Florida and Miami, my dad was down there. I was taking care of everything by myself. So I was just like trying to find these different coping mechanisms in order to stay, get better, like drinking charcoal water, or like taking all of these superficial self-care steps, when really like the way to heal guilt and shame and all of that is to just tell a story about it.
Yeah.
And, I think if we were more open as a society to like tell the stories that were embarrassing or tell our stories of shame, that we would be in a better place as a collective. I mean, easily. I mean, in a way, like I had a writer tell me recently, and obviously this is very much glorifying like the art of writing, but I think it falls for all forms of research around this subject as well, in psychology research, neurological research, anything surrounding this sort of human experience is humanitarian work. Because at the end of the day, the more you can learn and inform about yourself and learn about yourself and are able to share those things, the more other people will be able to learn and understand about themselves. And that's the only way I think that as a society, we're going to be able to really kind of like understand each other, is to understand ourselves first and then understand those around us based on our own experiences.
Yeah.
So it really is like, I find like this topic to be something that's really sort of, we could talk about this for days, and the variables that exist within it.
Although we talked very badly about social media from the very beginning, maybe because you said that telling your story was very helpful for you, and then sharing your story and sharing your experience, there are some people that use social media to like specifically do this, and they just find it very, very useful as well, just like to make videos and like write under Instagram posts like paragraphs long narratives, and then just share it with the wider community to find like a home for their thoughts and like their stories.
Yeah. So I won't go too much into my history, but I've had like experience of sexual assault as well, Tom. And I like was writing. I mean, I think you guys know part of this, but I was like involved like anonymously, sort of like on a forum and like discussing it. And I got a lot of help from that. But the other end of that on social media is that like, because people think, I don't know what goes through people's heads. They're young, they think it's funny to like provoke people or something. People would go on that forum because it's still publicly accessible and take people's trauma stories and like post them on porn websites or like whatever, and so it's like, yeah, it's hard. I think social media is difficult because you have this profound opportunity to connect with people in a deep way that you'll never meet in real life, and build a bond that's so unique because you don't even see each other face to face, which might make it easier to share some things. But at the same time, because it's such an uncontrolled, like public platform, it can also be accessed by people with bad intention. So you kind of have to really let go of the control and be prepared for both aspects of those things. And I don't know how to navigate that, like, at all. I think the younger generation has a better grasp over it. That's why.
I don't even know if they do, because I think there's so much. I mean, if I was to go deep into the experience of my experience with that, I would find that it might be sort of like confusing and contradictory and even like, hard to. I think there's so much. I mean, I look at examples like with that were publicly put out there, and during like different movements in the last few years regarding assault and stuff. And I think, there's so much to unpack that's not even being spoken about, and I know from my personal experience, most of my not speaking of it was because as a young gay man, part of me was so ashamed that maybe I enjoyed that. Maybe that was something that maybe that's what that was like because it was so unknown to me. You know, I mean, I had my, what do you call them, perpetrator's phone number for years because he gave it to me. What? So like, you know, like, and I never did anything with it because, you know, it was an experience that I was so confused by. And does that happen to men? And is that okay? And who do you talk to when that happens? And I remember, I mean, this is something I wrote about in that I'm writing about, but, you know, not to go too deep into it, but like, I remember getting home that night and having so much physical marking on my body that I hid it. And my dad, the next day, I woke up and I was going to talk to him. I was like, I have an opportunity right now. You know, my father, having been a cop for 25 years, you know, in his sort of relationship with law enforcement, I had an understanding that I was like, I can change this for me. I had an opportunity to change it. And when I went to talk to him, he had confronted me about finding weed in my jacket. And so it basically led me down two roads at that point. There was like, holy shit, I'm being reprimanded simultaneously for something so what seems so minimal compared to something that is I had just experienced, but I can't talk about it because it's being minimized so much by like a societal norm of like drug use now by a cop that like I have nobody to talk to. So it just went down to the like repressed hole.
Yeah.
Because who's going to understand that if the person who is closest to you, family, who is involved in law enforcement, isn't going to listen to you? Like, so you,
what you mean. Yeah.
You know, and you Staten Island. I mean, this is like, we're talking now Staten Island, like at that point, like, you know, like this is like traditional, like male figure on like
women
father.
Too.
Women too. Oh
when
yeah.
I opened up to my mom about it, it had to be like 3 or 4 years after I finally got the guts to tell my mom. And she paused and then she's just like, I heard somebody released a bunch of goldfish in this reservoir and they're growing real big.
When I came out to my father, when he was going to meet my boyfriend in college for the first time, he came to California. I came out to him and he told me my grandmother had skin cancer. I was like, what a way to I was like, whoa, the deflection on that. I was like, what? I was like, okay, so my thing is minimal now again. What's happening? Like, you know, it's that sort of thing. I mean, it's so easy for people to, it's so easy to have your sort of shame also minimized by so many people, you know, and that sort of stuff at the time.
You don't know what to do, you know?
I think that's it.
Yeah. I have sympathy for my mom's reaction now too. I mean, we've never spoken about it since either. So it's just like, you know, but at the same time, it's like, you know what, I don't need my mom's response on any of it. And in a way I kind of even feel bad that it's like, maybe she just really doesn't know how to handle it. Like, I don't, you know.
Yeah.
Your experience is so particularly interesting to me and very powerful because you also have all these stories and then you end up learning that your dad probably had similar experiences.
This was so amazing, you guys. Thank you so much for having me and thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hongbo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all your experience. Yeah, so if I got a last sentence I want to say is that psychologists really need to be curious and respectful to people's everyday experience of guilt and shame, rather than kind of define, operationalize those like from their armchair.
Yeah. So do you see a way of like developing a new neural signature of guilt or shame that's based more on narrative storytelling?
I can see that that's possible, right? Like if we have a rich repertoire of guilt and shame experience in terms in the form of short stories or narratives, I think we can definitely do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe eventually we could study your TV show, Tom.
I would love to do that. I mean, I would love to have you guys come back when we're doing something more concrete, or we have some more concrete material to talk about, I would love to share that with you. I don't know if script analysis is something that you guys do in your work, but I do have a pilot script that I'm happy to share with all of you to kind of read. It's 61 pages. It's a typical pilot, an hour-long episode, but it could be interesting if you are interested in doing that or looking at it.
How would you feel if people refer to your show as a guilty pleasure?
Oh, I'd love it. I'd love it.
Very cool.
Yeah. And come to LA. Marianne, I have an extra room.
Oh, I'm actually going to come down to LA in 2 weeks. I'll send you my date.
you because I'm vaccinated. Come over to Beverly Hills and we'll get a coffee.
All right.
And please come to Turkey.
That's probably not gonna happen for a while, though I'd love to, but I can't.
It's on a list.
I recently written the novel My Name is Red, and I feel curious. Yeah,
it's my favorite.
And I even have a Turkish coffee pot.
Oh, cool!
Oh, really?
Oh, wow!
Wow, yeah, you
got the real deal.
Well, you have our email, so yeah, hit us up when you're in Istanbul.
Awesome.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, have a beautiful Sunday, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marianne.
We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.